God, I'm bored.
You look bored.
I am bored. So how was the clink? Did you get the cookies I sent?
To be literate in some circles is to be an idiot. In the case of visual literacy, the understanding and breaking down of a movie's visual language, it is oftentimes the only way a director or filmmaker can actually fully develop their craft or get better. Visual literacy itself breaks down into two stages, the how phase and the why phase. The how phase is reaching a level of technical understanding when looking at a film that you understand how the cake is being made. You understand how the depth is being created, how the composition is being created, how the lighting sources are being created. You understand the how. The why phase is the eternal struggle that no director in this lifetime or our previous lifetimes has even come close to breaking down. One of my favorite directors, Akira Kurosawa, said that his greatest regret was dying before he could actually begin to understand the why behind the how. And it sounds simple. We are simply asking, okay, you know how to make this composition or camera move, but why here? Why this composition? Why are you creating depth this way? Why this lens? Why are they staged like that? And you can answer all of those questions and still be wrong. Visual literacy is about becoming technically informed enough to make choices and then learning from the choices you make, because your choices are never going to be perfect. They may be right, they may be wrong, but they're never going to be correct. Most great directors, especially Kurosawa, strived for finding the way to be correct. And almost a century and a half in, we haven't even come close, and we likely never will. Visual literacy is about the pursuit of being perfect. It is about the endless process of learning and striving to understand the ultimate unison between image and story.
Quisiste volar sin alas, quisiste tocar el cielo, quisiste mucha riqueza, quisiste jugar con fuego y ahora te quité.
So let's build from the start. Let's start to understand visual literacy from the start. The first ingredient in the cake is the frame. Everything comes from the frame. Lighting, color, etc. are all additive. They are the frosting. A frame can either be a composition or a subject shot. A composition in this sense is a frame with three distinct layers of depth: a foreground, a midground, and a background. What creates that depth, however, and how staging exists within it, is a product of the story, which we'll get to later. Right now, if you're building the frame, you always make sure you have three distinct layers of depth, or a subject shot, which is where the composition is foregoed for a subject. Think a close-up, a medium close-up, anything where the subject seems to be the only isolated variable in the frame. Imagine that your compositions are a meal, and your subject shots are hot sauce. You can't make a meal with just hot sauce, but your meal would also be entirely bland without it. The next part of the frame is the lighting. How do we use the sources at our disposal to highlight the composition or depth that we're creating? Furthermore, how do we do that in tandem with the story, which we'll get to later? Lighting is, and always will be, a function of composition. Composition is what makes things inherently cinematic, not lighting. Composition is the building block. The light is the garnish. Without composition, it is almost impossible to make something look cinematic, especially in a storytelling sense. If you shoot a man in a corner, it doesn't really matter how you light it, it's always going to look bad because it's flat, because there's no depth, there's no composition. Composition can exist cinematically without light, but light cannot exist cinematically without composition, especially when it comes to story. However, when the two are combined, that is how the most beautiful imagery in some of your favorite films are created. From a visual language standpoint, lighting is about supporting your composition, about highlighting it. It's about adding another cinematic or storytelling layer on top of the compositional foundation that you've created. If you must rely on your light to create depth, to shape a composition, you have now lost your story because you are now lighting for depth and not for story. But again, we'll get to that later. Think about lighting this way. If I have a shot with 3 layers of depth, I likely need to be doing a couple things with my lighting to support that. I need some sort of fill or absence of fill in my foreground and background to accentuate or shape the depth. I need a key light defining my midground and my subject, and a backlight or rim light specifically to shape the subject a bit more in that composition. But the most important thing is to make it feel like it exists within the composition. Do not draw attention to your light, just support the image. All of these techniques can also go away if they draw too much from the composition, the story, and the naturality of what you're trying to create. Visual literacy is about choices. You learn so you can strip away.
How can you not be romantic about baseball?
It's a metaphor.
I know it's a metaphor.
The next part of the cake, now that we've covered how to create and light a frame, is the camera movement. Camera movement is essentially the process of moving from one subject or composition to another subject or composition. You simply go from frame A to frame B. Do I start on my subject and end on a composition? Do I track with my subject to a composition? Think of a camera movement like a math problem. Frame A plus frame B plus frame C equals a complete shot. Crafting camera movement is as simple as applying all the rules we just talked about to the frame you start on, to the frame you end on, and to whatever frames you create in between. Now, deciding those frames and how you move between them is 100% dependent on the story, but now we've at least covered the math behind it. Always think of camera movement as math. The next and final part of the cake is storyboarding. It's essentially how you process all of the technical framing, lighting, and movement requirements into a concrete plan. I'm not talking about taking shots from other movies or having a reference board or having a vibe sheet. Those are frankly kind of useless. I'm talking about sitting down with a pencil and a notebook and hand drawing every single frame. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It could be as crude as 2 stick figures in a long hallway. But it's about having the composition and the image already created so you can understand how it affects the story. It's about making your movement math as easy as possible by simply just drawing a line between the 2 frames you just created. It's about creating the movie and its visual language before you even show up to set. It's about understanding the entirety of your movie, frame by frame, setup by setup, movement by movement, so that you have the freedom to pivot and create if you want to. Most of the time you set up, you frame it exactly how you have it drawn, you shoot it, and you move on. Because the hour you spent designing that shot on a piece of paper is an hour saved on the day. Once you understand composition, it's easy to show up to a location and know where each of the individual frames are or could be. But when it comes to story, that can only be understood visually through staring at a crude stick figure drawing in a dark room, at what you designed. And that's because beforehand, you took the time to create it, to understand it, to figure out what it's achieving, how it's making the audience feel, rather than just pointing to a spot on the day because the composition looks cool. I've seen a lot of cool shots with no narrative resonance. I'm sure you have too. At the end of the day, visual literacy is not about creating cool shots. It's about telling a story. And this is where things get fun. Now we get to talk about each of these basics of visual literacy within the overall context of storytelling. After all, that's what visual literacy is. How do we take what we just talked about, what we just learned, and use it to tell a story? Let's first talk about lenses and framing. Imagine that each shot in your film exists to serve a very specific purpose in your story. Imagine it as a collage. Up close, it may seem like just another shot. But if you zoom out, the collage, the story, becomes visible. It takes shape. However, If all your shots tend to look the same or rely on the same 9-point coverage, zooming out suddenly, there is no collage. There is no story. Because visually, there is no distinction between any of the bits and pieces that are creating it. If it all looks the same, and it all feels the same, then it is not a collage. It's not telling a story. A collage is a collection of different pieces, not one and the same, just like a story. And so how do we create this story? Again, let's get back to lenses and framing. Obviously, in terms of framing, our visual language can be very limited. We are stuck choosing between the subject shot and the composition. There is freedom within the composition, sure, in two ways. A, how things or people are staged in order to visually tell the story. B, how things or people are framed in order to visually tell the story. And these go hand in hand. You start with the blocking. You start with designing the movement of the actors to best tell the story. What is human? What is real? What creates a visual reaction from us as an audience? And then, the most difficult part. You don't simply create a shot with depth in order to capture this blocking, because then you are capturing, not storytelling. The shot you create, the composition, while maintaining those rules of depth and capturing the performance, needs to generate a feeling in the audience or further the story of the characters and script. Simply put, you have to create blocking that tells the story. And then within that, you have to create images that tell the story. And then the question is, how do we want these images to make people feel? What is the texture of the image, the closeness of the image, the feeling of the image, the scene? That's how we decide on our lenses. If I have a scene that I want to feel subliminally claustrophobic, maybe I choose to shoot no wider than a 50mm lens on all of my compositions. Your lens choices are a direct proponent of the story, and it should always be changing. Think about the way in which emotional beats change in a scene. If I change my lenses and compositions to reflect those beats, I'm changing my visual language in order to tell the story. Visual language is all about change. The change between types of language is often just as important as the language itself. What does going from a 50 to a 14 do to the narrative feeling of a scene? If I play the whole scene on compositions and then cut to a close, how does that make the audience feel? If we go back to the collage, in a given scene zooming out, your types of framing and your types of lens choices should be able to tell the emotional path of a scene just by looking at it. And zooming out further, your choices in that scene should be different from the choices in the next, and the next scene, and the next scene. Each scene with its own visual language in order to create the final visual language of the film. That's how stories are told. And that's again why storyboarding, actually drawing your shots, is so important. And the same applies to camera movement. The state that your camera exists in should always be changing or staying the same from shot to shot, depending on the story you're trying to tell and the emotional beats of your scene. Camera movement is the ultimate way to build and break reality in a film, to build and break expectation. If you watch any PTA movie, he rarely uses the same type of movement in back-to-back scenes. Each scene has its own unique type of movement that's unique to that scene. That's how he creates his collage, his stories. Think about the way in which a camera move can make us feel, and think about the different states of the camera that cause that. Even changing the speed of your moves can have a drastic effect on an audience's feeling when watching a given scene. A slow dolly versus a fast dolly can greatly change an audience's perception of a given line, scene, or emotional beat. The relation of speed from shot to shot is also incredibly impactful. How does a slow move, then a slow move, then a fast move make the audience feel? How about slowly speeding up your moves throughout a scene? How does it help us tell the story? The same goes for the type of movement. A dolly feels markedly different from a Steadicam, or handheld, or zooming, or sticks, or a crane. The type of movement you choose in a given moment, and how it relates to the movement choices before and after, are some of the most powerful ways you can choose to tell your story. Camera movement, and movement in general, are some of the most powerful ways to affect the emotional perception of an audience. I'd greatly recommend checking out Rudolf von Laban's movement theory and how that applies to people as well. The way we move, or don't move is powerful. In the grand collage of a scene, act, or entire film, your movement choices and the differentiation between them are really where the core of your story is built. You must constantly be creating and subverting expectations with the types of movement that you're using. That's how you make each choice feel real, impactful, and grounded in the story, because the audience does not feel that your choices and types of movement are simply just one and the same. If you graphed your type of movement across the entire narrative arc of the movie, your death would be a straight line, or even a curved one at that. If you graphed a PTA movie in this sense, it would look more like a crazed heart monitor than any actual display of data. At the end of the day, it's all about the story. Every piece of movement, lens type, type of framing, written down in name only, should be able to communicate the emotional backbone or journey of a movie through merely words alone. That is visual literacy. And that is the point where your choices become purely of the story and of nothing else. The mind of the individual is gone and has been replaced by the heart of the narrative. That is visual literacy. And this is not the end-all be-all. I'm sure that there is infinitely more to be understood when it comes to using the visual form to tell a story. This is simply what I've learned from failing and what I hope to apply. And I'm also sure that you don't need to be this precise in order to make a good film. There are plenty of good films that simply don't take the extra step visually, like I'm talking about. At the end of the day, it comes down to the individual. Budget does not fully affect the prep or literacy that I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is hopefully setting a foundation that can one day aid in the likely endless pursuit of fully understanding visual storytelling. Film is about learning, and for me, I think it always will be. No director tells stories perfectly. Not Kurosawa, not Scorsese, not Kubrick. The human will never be fully taken over by the story. And the medium of film will also never be fully understood. It is impossible to be perfect or to make a movie the right way, but we can learn. At the end of the day, do you believe in perfection or do you chase it? If you chase perfection, you will eternally get better. If you believe in perfection, you will never complete anything. And a film must be completed. A story must be told. And the most human way to do that is by being imperfect.